The evening service had just ended. The lights in Elevation Church's main sanctuary dimmed to a soft glow as the last worship song faded away, leaving behind a sacred silence. Pastor Steven Furtick stood by the edge of the stage, offering a few final handshakes, words of encouragement, and the occasional prayer. He felt the familiar weight of spiritual leadership settle deeper on his shoulders. The thousands of lives he impacted, the pressures of a global ministry, none of it felt overwhelming tonight. But something else did, something he couldn't name. Steven had noticed it for weeks. No, months. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, not in the church, but in the demeanor of his secretary, Julia. She had been his assistant for over 4 years, efficient, sharp, always 2 steps ahead of his schedule. But recently, her spark had faded. She arrived early and left quietly. Her eyes, once bright and alert, had grown dull and hollow. When he asked how she was, she would smile tightly and say, "I'm blessed, Pastor." But he wasn't convinced. That evening, as he watched Julia slip out of the building faster than usual, something inside him stirred. A sense, call it discernment, call it the Holy Spirit, pressed on his heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. So for the first time in his ministry, Pastor Steven Furtick did something out of character. He grabbed his coat, walked briskly out the side door, and followed her. She drove a modest, silver sedan, one he hadn't seen before. Steven kept his distance, far enough to avoid suspicion, but close enough to stay on her trail. His black SUV blended into the night, aided by the quiet suburban streets of Charlotte. He told himself he'd just follow her to see where she went. That's it. No confrontation. No questions. Just a check-in. A shepherd looking after one of his flock. But as they drove farther away from the affluent neighborhoods near the church and into the older, more neglected parts of town, his concern deepened. This wasn't just a late-night errand or a forgotten appointment. Julia was heading somewhere she didn't want anyone to know about. Eventually, she pulled into a small, dimly lit parking lot behind an aging apartment complex. The building looked forgotten by time. Faded paint, cracked windows, trash scattered near the dumpsters. Julia parked, sat motionless for a few seconds, then got out, carrying a worn leather bag and a plastic grocery sack. Steven parked down the block, his heart pounding. He waited until she disappeared through the back entrance before stepping out. He felt ridiculous. He was a well-known pastor, sneaking around like a detective in a movie. But that inner voice, that divine nudge, refused to let go. He moved closer, staying in the shadows. The air was cold and sharp. Through a ground-floor window, he caught a glimpse of Julia inside a dimly lit apartment. He saw her kneel beside a frail, elderly woman lying on a worn-out couch. Julia gently brushed the woman's hair back, murmuring something with tenderness, then began unpacking the groceries. Cans of soup, medication, hygiene products. She wiped the woman's face with a warm cloth, placed a kiss on her forehead, and then knelt to pray. Steven's throat tightened. He had never seen this side of her. Compassionate, yes. Committed, of course. But this was sacrificial love in action. It was raw, unfiltered, and humbling to watch. He remained frozen outside the window for several minutes, unsure what to do next. A part of him wanted to walk away and let her have her privacy. Another part of him knew he needed to understand what he had just witnessed. Before he could make up his mind, Julia exited the apartment, wiping tears from her cheeks. Steven ducked behind a bush, feeling ashamed. She passed him without seeing, heading back toward her car. He stepped out into the open and called her name softly. "Julia?" She froze, turned. Her eyes widened with shock. "Pastor Steven? Why are you here?" He took a few hesitant steps toward her. I followed you. I was worried. I noticed something's been off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that you were carrying something heavy." Her shoulders slumped. For a moment she looked like she might run. Then she exhaled and whispered, "You weren't wrong." He gestured gently toward the apartment. "Who is she?" "My mom," Julia said, voice cracking. "She's dying. Cancer. No insurance. We couldn't afford treatment. I bring her food and meds when I can. I've been doing this every night after work." Steven felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you come to me?" She shook her head, tears now streaming freely. "Because I didn't want pity. I didn't want to be a burden. Everyone at church looks up to me. I couldn't bear to let them see this." Steven stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Julia, you're not a burden. You're a blessing. What you're doing for your mother, it's one of the most Christ-like things I've ever seen." She sobbed, finally allowing herself to release the emotion she'd held back for so long. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "I'm drowning." Steven stood there in the cold night air, deeply convicted. This woman who had served so faithfully behind the scenes had been quietly suffering, sacrificing, surviving. And he hadn't noticed until now. But that was going to change. Steven didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there beside Julia in the dim glow of the street lamp, the cold biting into his skin, humbled by what he had witnessed. In all his years of preaching about compassion, faith, and community, nothing had prepared him for the quiet power of Julia's sacrifice. "Can I see her?" he asked gently. Julia hesitated, eyes widening with surprise. "My mom. Are you sure?" "I'm not here as Pastor Steven right now," he said. "I'm just a brother in Christ. If you'd let me, I'd like to pray with her. And with you?" Her lips quivered as she nodded slowly. "Okay." They walked back toward the apartment together, the silence between them now filled with something sacred. When Julia opened the door, the smell of musty fabric and antiseptic hit Steven's senses. The apartment was small, cramped, sparsely furnished, but there was a warmth here, not from the heater, which barely worked, but from the presence of love. Her mother lay on the couch, eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. She was thin, her face drawn and pale, but there was a softness to her features, a quiet beauty that hadn't been erased by illness. "Mom," Julia whispered, "someone's here to see you." The woman opened her eyes slowly. When she saw Steven, recognition sparked in her expression, followed by disbelief. You're Pastor Steven Furtick." Steven knelt beside her couch, gently taking her frail hand. "Yes, ma'am, and I'm honored to be here with you tonight." Tears welled in her eyes. "I watch your sermons on my phone, when I still had strength to sit up." Steven smiled warmly. "That means the world to me. But tonight I'm here to pray with you, to thank you, because the love you poured into your daughter, she's been pouring it into all of us." Julia's mother tried to sit up, but Steven gently helped her stay relaxed. Then he bowed his head, and with quiet conviction, he began to pray. "Father God, thank you for this sacred moment. Thank you for this precious woman, for the life she has lived and the love she has shown. Thank you for Julia, your faithful servant, who has borne this burden alone for too long. We ask for your healing hand, for peace that surpasses all understanding. Wrap this family in your grace tonight." The room was thick with presence, holy, peaceful, profound. When the prayer ended, Julia was sobbing silently beside him, and even her mother had closed her eyes again, as if the prayer had given her a moment of rest. Steven stood slowly, his heart aching in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm going to make some calls," he said to Julia. "There are people at Elevation who would be honored to help you. Financially, emotionally, spiritually. You're not alone anymore. We're going to walk this road with you." Julia tried to protest, but Steven held up a hand. "No arguments. You've served all of us in silence. Now it's our turn to serve you." For the first time in weeks, Julia smiled. Not the rehearsed, forced smile she wore at work, but a real one. Faint, tired, but real. That night, Steven couldn't sleep. He lay in bed replaying the entire evening, the image of Julia kneeling by her mother haunting his thoughts. How many others were suffering in silence, right under his nose? How many other Julias filled the pews each Sunday, smiling on the outside while carrying unbearable pain? He realized something had to change. The next morning, Steven called an emergency meeting with his executive team. As they gathered in the conference room, still groggy from their morning routines, Steven stood at the head of the table with a fire in his spirit they hadn't seen in years. "We've built a beautiful church," he began. "Powerful sermons, global outreach, music that moves people, but we're missing something. We've become good at church, but not always good at being the church. Confused glances were exchanged around the table. He continued, "Last night, I followed Julia." Gasps. "I didn't mean to violate her privacy. I was worried, and what I discovered shook me. Her mother is dying. She's been caring for her in secret, sacrificing everything, going home to a place that looks like it's one paycheck away from collapse. And she never said a word." Silence filled the room. We've created a culture where people feel like they have to have it all together. Even our own staff are afraid to admit when they're drowning. "That ends now." One of the pastors spoke up. "What do you want to do?" Stephen's eyes burned with conviction. "I want a new ministry launched by the end of this week. We'll call it Elevation Cares. I want it to be a safe place where staff and congregation alike can come forward. No judgment, no shame, just help. Counseling, medical support, financial guidance, food assistance, whatever it takes." There were nods around the table. Some were already scribbling ideas. Others sat stunned, processing the weight of his words. "And one more thing," Stephen added. "We're going to take care of Julia's mom. Fully. Every treatment, every bill. We'll renovate that apartment, get her proper care, and give Julia the rest she needs. Not just because she's staff, but because she's family." Tears welled up in the eyes of a few around the table. That day, Elevation Church took its first real steps toward becoming something deeper than a Sunday service. By nightfall, the news had spread. Volunteers lined up to be part of the new ministry. Donations poured in without even being requested. Julia, overwhelmed and humbled, watched it all unfold in disbelief. Stephen visited her again that evening. This time, he brought his wife, Holly, and their teenage son. They came with warm meals, blankets, and quiet companionship. As the evening wore on, Julia's mom drifted into sleep, comforted by the presence of new friends. Julia sat on the small balcony outside, Stephen beside her. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You already did," Stephen said, "by showing me what real ministry looks like." They sat in silence, watching the stars blink into view. For the first time in a long time, both of them felt like they could breathe again. The following Sunday, the energy inside Elevation Church was different. There was a quiet buzz of expectancy in the air, something deeper than excitement. It felt like something sacred had been stirred in the heart of the congregation. As worship ended and Pastor Steven took the stage, there was no flashy introduction. No dramatic build-up, just him. A man changed. He looked out over the crowd and took a long pause before speaking. "Last week," he began, "I learned something I should have known a long time ago. I learned that some of the people closest to me, people who give their all to this church, are hurting silently. And I realized that as your pastor, I've preached about carrying each other's burdens, but I haven't always made it safe for you to do that." A hush settled over the sanctuary. "I want to tell you a story about someone many of you know. Julia, my assistant. She gave me permission to share this." He recounted everything he'd seen. The late-night drive, the tiny apartment, Julia's mother, the prayers, the heartbreak, the silence of someone too proud, too faithful, or too afraid to ask for help. There were audible gasps and sniffles from the crowd. Some bowed their heads, others clutched their hands together. She never asked for help, not once, because she believed that needing help made her weak, that serving meant never struggling. But the truth is, we all need help, even pastors, even secretaries, even you. Stephen's voice broke just slightly, and he let it. "So today I'm not here to preach a sermon. I'm here to ask for forgiveness. And to say that from this day forward, this church will be a place where you don't have to hide your pain to be part of the family." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't the usual roar of agreement that followed a fiery sermon. It was softer, filled with emotion. It was approval mixed with conviction and gratitude. Stephen stepped down from the platform that day without his usual energy, but something far more powerful was behind him now: the truth. Later that afternoon, while volunteers helped install a new heater in Julia's mother's apartment and a nurse evaluated her condition, Stephen sat in his office, reviewing applications for the Elevation Cares initiative. The stories poured in faster than he expected. Single parents on the verge of eviction, elderly members without proper medication, teens hiding depression behind social media smiles. He read every word. And for the first time in years, Steven felt closer to the heartbeat of the people he served, not as a preacher, but as a brother, a listener. That night, Julia sent him a text. She's smiling again. She says she hasn't felt this safe in years. Thank you. Steven stared at the message, heart full. Then he texted back, "No, Julia, thank you for trusting me. We're in this together now." But the following week would test that promise in ways none of them could have expected. On a cold Thursday morning, Steven received a call from the nurse stationed at Julia's mom's apartment. Her condition had worsened overnight, rapidly. The cancer had spread aggressively, and her body was beginning to shut down. Without a second thought, Steven cleared his day and rushed over. When he arrived, he found Julia sitting at her mother's side, holding her hand, tears silently streaming down her face. "She doesn't have much time," she whispered. Steven moved to her side and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's pray." They prayed. They sang. They shared stories. Her mother, though barely able to speak, smiled weakly at the sound of her daughter's voice and Steven's gentle prayers. By sunset, she was gone. Julia didn't cry at first. She just sat there, frozen, her hands still wrapped around her mother's. Steven didn't rush her. He didn't speak. He just sat with her in silence. Eventually, Julia looked up, eyes red and exhausted. "I thought I'd be prepared for this." "No one is," Steven said softly. She nodded. "But I'm grateful. She didn't die alone. She died knowing she was seen, that people cared, that God cared." A few days later, the church held a small private memorial. Steven officiated, but it wasn't like his usual services. It was simpler, more personal. He spoke of sacrifice, of love, of unseen acts of faith that shine brighter than any sermon. He honored Julia's mother not just for the life she lived, but for the legacy of love she left behind in her daughter. After the service, Steven took Julia aside. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I want you to lead Elevation Cares." Julia blinked. "Me? You've lived it," he said. "You know what it means to suffer quietly, to serve without asking for anything in return. Who better to lead a ministry that brings healing to others than someone who's walked through the fire and still believes?" Tears welled in her eyes again. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." He smiled gently. "That's exactly why you are." The next few months were a whirlwind. Under Julia's leadership, Elevation Cares grew faster than anyone predicted. Weekly prayer support groups filled up. Financial assistance was distributed discreetly and efficiently. Volunteers flooded in from every corner of the church. People opened up about grief, mental illness, abuse, addiction, and one by one, healing began. Steven continued to preach, but now with a deeper authenticity. His messages weren't just inspirational. They were grounded in reality, shaped by the pain and beauty of his congregation's real lives. He often spoke of Julia's mother, of the apartment window, of that cold night when God taught him more through silence and compassion than any sermon ever could. And every time he did, Julia sat in the front row, no longer invisible, no longer silent, but whole. 3 months passed, and the rhythm of life at Elevation Church began to feel different. Slower in some ways, deeper in others. There was more listening now, more eye contact in the hallways, more prayer whispered in quiet corners of the building. Steven could feel it in every interaction. The church was healing, one heart at a time. But as the ministry grew, so did the weight it carried. Julia, now head of Elevation Cares, worked tirelessly. She organized teams, led meetings, sat in counseling sessions, answered emergency calls at all hours. Steven noticed the same spark that had once faded starting to flicker again, but along with it, a new exhaustion. This time, it was spiritual. Not from pain, but from pouring herself out constantly. One afternoon, Steven invited her into his office. A fresh pot of coffee sat between them, untouched. "You're doing too much," he said gently. She gave a tired laugh. "That's ironic coming from you." He smiled. "Touché, but I mean it. You've done incredible things, but now it's time to build a team around you." "You're not called to carry this alone." Julia hesitated. "It just feels like if I stop, even for a moment, someone else will fall through the cracks. And I can't let that happen." Steven leaned forward. "You're not the savior, Julia. You're the servant. And servants need rest too." Her shoulders slumped. He could see how badly she needed someone to say that out loud. "I just miss her," she said softly. "Every night I come home and it's too quiet. I keep thinking I'll hear her voice again, but I don't." Steven nodded. "That silence is brutal, but you're not walking through it alone." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small book, a journal. He handed it to her. "What's this?" "I've been writing," he said. "Since the night I followed you. Reflections, prayers, lessons I'm still learning. I thought maybe some of the words might help you too." Julia held the journal gently like something sacred. "Thank you." That night she went home and opened the journal. Page after page was filled with Steven's handwriting, raw, unpolished, honest. "Sometimes I think we miss the miracles because they come dressed like people in pain. I used to think leading meant preaching louder. Now I think it means listening longer. I followed Julia that night because something in my spirit told me to. I didn't expect to find God waiting in a run-down apartment." As she read, Julia wept, not from grief this time, but from gratitude. Someone had seen her, truly seen her, and now, through her story, others were being seen too. Over the following weeks, Julia began training volunteers to take over parts of the ministry. She held group sessions where stories were shared without shame. People found healing in each other's honesty. It was beautiful. It was messy. It was real. One evening, after leading a support group for widows, Julia stayed behind to clean up. As she gathered coffee cups and folded chairs, an older woman approached her quietly. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said. "Tonight was the first time I've said my husband's name out loud since he died. I didn't think I had the strength, but your story gave me courage." Julia smiled, eyes misty. "Thank you for sharing him with us." The woman squeezed her hand and left. As Julia turned off the lights, she paused in the doorway, overcome by a thought. Maybe this was what her mother had prayed for all along, that her daughter would become someone who brought light to the brokenhearted. Meanwhile, Steven found himself drawn into stories he never would have heard before Elevation Cares began. He sat in hospital rooms, visited prisons, walked through shelters. He met people whose lives had been touched by Julia's story, even if they'd never met her. One young man, a recovering addict, stood up during a Sunday testimony and said, "I didn't believe in church people. I thought they were all fake. But then I heard about this pastor who followed his secretary because he cared. And I thought, maybe there's still something good left in the world." The congregation broke into applause. After the service, Steven pulled Julia aside. "You're changing lives," he said. "No," she replied with a smile. "We are." They both laughed, standing in the hallway of a church that was no longer just known for its size or its music or its influence, but for its heart. That weekend, Steven received a call from a national Christian magazine. They wanted to do a feature on Elevation Cares. A full spread, interviews, photography, a story about transformation and healing. At first, he hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to turn Julia's pain into publicity. But when he brought it up with her, she surprised him. "Let them," she said. "Let the world see what God can do with brokenness. Maybe someone will read it and finally ask for help." And so the article was published. The headline read, "A pastor followed his secretary one night, and it changed an entire church." It went viral. Emails and letters poured in from all over the country. Other churches wanted to replicate the model. Leaders confessed their own burnout. Mothers shared stories of sacrifice. Fathers admitted they didn't know how to ask for help. Julia received hundreds of messages from strangers thanking her for being vulnerable, for making it okay to not be okay, and quietly, without seeking the spotlight, she kept working, not to be seen, but to see others. Months later, the ripple effects of that one night, when Steven followed Julia, were still expanding. Elevation Cares had become more than a ministry, it had become the beating heart of the church. But with growth came new complexities. Needs piled up. Requests grew heavier. and stories became more intense. One afternoon, Steven sat across from a woman in her early 30s named Alicia. She had come in through the Elevation Care's intake process after hearing about it online. Her husband had recently taken his own life. She was left with 2 small children and a mountain of debt. She was calm on the outside, composed even, but Steven could see the numbness behind her eyes. "I haven't cried," she said. "Not once. Everyone says I'm so strong, but really, I think I'm broken. I just don't have the luxury of falling apart." Steven leaned forward. "You don't have to be strong for us, Alicia. Not here, not with God, and not with yourself. You're not broken, you're grieving." She looked away. "I just want someone to tell me it's okay to not be okay." Steven nodded, his voice low. "Then hear me say it now. It's okay. You don't have to carry it alone. We're here, and we're going to walk with you through this." As she broke down, finally letting the tears fall, Steven silently thanked God for the night he had followed Julia. If he hadn't, Alicia might have never walked through their doors. And how many more were still out there, waiting for someone to notice? Back at the apartment complex where Julia's mother had once lived, a transformation was underway. With funding from Elevation Cares and a growing network of donors, they began renovating not just Julia's former home, but several units in the same building. It was Steven's idea, a sort of tribute. They called it the Ruth Project. Each apartment would house women in crisis, abuse survivors, single mothers, women recovering from addiction, providing safety, counseling, and dignity. Julia oversaw the program with quiet intensity, walking those halls daily, remembering every crack in the wall from when her mother was alive. One day Steven joined her during an inspection of the nearly completed first floor. "I can't believe it," Julia whispered, running her hand along the smooth, freshly painted walls. "It's beautiful." He smiled. "It's more than beautiful. It's sacred, just like the love you showed your mom." Julia looked up at him, eyes glassy. "Sometimes I still think about that night, how you followed me, how angry I was when I saw you there." Steven laughed gently. "I was terrified you'd never speak to me again." "I almost didn't," she said, "but I think, deep down, I was waiting for someone to come find me." Her voice cracked. "And you did." They stood there in silence, letting the memory wash over them. Steven broke the quiet. "I think this place is going to find a lot more people, Julia, and change them forever." And it did. The first woman to move into the Ruth Project was named Carla. She was a mother of 3, escaping an abusive marriage. She arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and bruises that weren't all visible. Julia met her at the door, held her hand, and said, "You're safe now." Over the next few weeks, Steven watched as Carla transformed. She began attending Elevation's support groups, found a job, and one Sunday morning stood on stage and gave her testimony. She said, "I thought the world had forgotten me, but then I met people who didn't ask questions. They just opened the door, and for the first time in my life, I walked through it and didn't feel ashamed." Tears fell across the congregation. Steven looked out and saw Julia in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, her head bowed in silent gratitude. After the service, he pulled her aside again. "You're changing the trajectory of people's lives," he said. Julia shook her head. "No, God is. I'm just finally learning to get out of his way." But even as things grew, Steven knew Julia carried one quiet burden that hadn't yet been addressed. Grief. Real grief. Not just over her mother's death, but over all the years she had hidden herself, suppressed her voice, and worked herself to the bone, believing she had to prove her worth. So he arranged something without telling her. One Saturday, he asked her to meet him at a local park. When she arrived, she found a small group of women, widows, mothers, counselors, prayer warriors, waiting for her in a circle of chairs beneath a giant oak tree. There were candles, warm drinks, blankets. Steven stood to the side, watching. Julia hesitated. "What is this?" "It's for you," he said. "A space to grieve, to rest, to be held." The women welcomed her in without question. They prayed, they shared, they listened. And finally, Julia spoke, not as a leader, not as a caretaker, but as a daughter who missed her mother more than she could express. She cried, hard. ugly sobs that shook her body, and the women held her. Later, as the sky turned pink with sunset, Julia sat alone with Steven. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is let someone else carry us." She laughed through her tears. "You're not the same pastor I started working for." "Good," he said. I needed to change. They sat in silence, the wind moving gently through the trees. Steven looked up and smiled. "I followed you that night because something felt off," he said. "But maybe deep down I needed you as much as you needed someone to see you." Julia rested her head back and looked at the sky. "I think we both found what we didn't know we were looking for." The seasons shifted slowly from summer into fall. The trees around Charlotte burned with color, their leaves tumbling like whispers across the pavement. It had been almost a year since that cold night, when Steven first followed Julia, and yet it still echoed in every decision he made, every message he preached, every life they touched through Elevation Cares and the Ruth Project. One Sunday morning, Steven stood behind the pulpit with a worn Bible in one hand and Julia's old leather journal in the other. He'd asked her permission to share an excerpt, one she had written in the days just after her mother passed. He cleared his throat. She wrote, "There is a silence after someone dies that feels like it could swallow you whole. But I've learned that God often speaks loudest through that silence. I just wasn't listening before." He looked out across the packed sanctuary. "I think that's where many of us live, between silence and sorrow. But God is in both, and sometimes the only way to hear Him is to let the silence speak." That message became one of his most shared sermons of the year. People began coming forward in droves, not just for help, but to serve, to listen, to heal each other. Elevation Cares tripled in size. The Ruth Project had a waitlist of women desperate for a safe place. The church had become less about the stage and more about the quiet corners, where hugs were exchanged, prayers whispered, stories finally spoken. One afternoon, Steven received a letter from a man in Pennsylvania, a pastor. He had read the magazine article and watched the sermons. His words were shaky, written in uneven lines. "I've been pastoring for 22 years. I'm tired. My wife left me 2 months ago. My kids won't speak to me. I haven't told my congregation any of it. I feel like I'm drowning, but I don't know how to stop pretending. I read about you following Julia, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. I don't know why I'm writing this. I guess I just needed someone to know." Steven read it 3 times. Then he picked up the phone, called the man personally, and spent 2 hours on the line with him. That conversation would be the first of many. Over the months that followed, Steven began mentoring a group of burned-out pastors from across the country. They formed a small virtual circle, meeting weekly, confessing without fear, praying without performance. Julia sat in on a few of the sessions, sharing her journey, her scars, her healing. And every time, Steven remembered that night, that choice, that single moment of obedience that had become the doorway to revival, not just in the church, but in himself. But even blessings come with burdens. One night, well past midnight, Steven received a call. A woman from the Ruth Project had gone missing. Her name was Tiana, a 24-year-old mother of one who had been recovering from opioid addiction. She'd shown incredible progress, attending support groups, finding part-time work, even mentoring other women. But something had shifted that week, and now she was gone. Julia was already at the apartment complex when Steven arrived. Her face was pale, tense. "She left a note," Julia said. "Said she didn't think she deserved this second chance, that the guilt was louder than the grace." Steven felt a weight drop in his chest. "Do we know where she might have gone?" Julia shook her head. "She mentioned an old shelter downtown in one of our meetings. She stayed there before we found her." They didn't hesitate. In the middle of the night, the two of them drove through the heart of the city, passing shuttered businesses and the neon glow of all-night diners. They reached the shelter, a decaying building with flickering lights and rusted signs. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with despair. A few volunteers were present, offering blankets, soup, quiet comfort. After speaking to the front desk, they found her, curled up on a metal bench, arms wrapped around her knees, face streaked with tears. Steven approached slowly. "Tiana," he said gently. She looked up, startled. "Pastor? Julia? I thought I could do it," she whispered. "I thought I was strong enough." Steven sat beside her. "No one is strong enough alone. I keep remembering everything I've done, all the people I hurt. And I think, how can God still love me after all that?" Julia knelt in front of her. "Because love isn't earned, Tiana. It's given, freely. That's what grace is. But I don't feel worthy." "None of us do," Steven said. "That's the miracle." Tiana began to sob, not quietly. Loud, aching cries that echoed off the concrete walls. And there, in that cold, forgotten shelter, Steven and Julia wrapped their arms around her and didn't let go. They brought her back to the Ruth Project that night. Volunteers were waiting, a warm bed, a nurse, a counselor, and the next morning, Tiana sat in the small courtyard of the building and whispered through cracked lips, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Julia smiled. "We never will." After that night, they added a new layer to the Ruth Project, a 24-hour crisis team, counselors on call, spiritual mentors ready at any hour. They called it the Midnight Watch in honor of the hour they found Tiana. Steven mentioned it in a sermon a few weeks later. Sometimes the greatest ministry happens when the world is asleep, when someone sits beside a soul in crisis and says, "I see you, I'm not leaving." That's what Jesus did, and that's what we're called to do. The congregation responded with tears, standing ovations, and above all, action. And back in his journal, Steven wrote a single sentence that summarized it all. One act of obedience can change an entire world. Thanksgiving arrived with a sense of reverence that year. At Elevation Church, the holiday season usually brought special services, festive music, and bustling charity drives. But this time, there was something quieter, more sacred, running beneath the surface. A collective awareness of how much healing had already taken place, and how much more was still needed. Steven decided to do something different that week. Instead of a traditional sermon, he invited members of the church to share what they were thankful for. Open mic, no filters, no rehearsals. Julia was hesitant at first. Public speaking wasn't her favorite, and she didn't consider herself a storyteller. But when the microphone was passed to her, something in the room shifted. She stood before the congregation, took a deep breath, and looked out over the hundreds of faces staring back at her. "A year ago, I thought my life was ending," she began. "My mother was dying. I was working myself to the bone, hiding behind my smile, convinced no one could ever understand. And then, someone followed me." Soft laughter rippled through the room. Steven smiled, arms folded as he watched from the side. "I was angry at first," she continued, "but now I see it for what it was. Mercy. God used that moment to unravel all the walls I had built around my heart." Her voice wavered. "My mom passed away knowing she was loved, and I've spent this year trying to pass that love on. Through every support group, every hug, every tear we've shared at the Ruth Project, I've felt her there, and I've felt him there. So if you ask me what I'm thankful for, it's simple. I'm thankful for grace, and for the people who chase after the hurting instead of waiting for them to speak." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When Julia returned to her seat, Steven reached over and squeezed her hand. "You just preached a better sermon than I ever have," he whispered. She laughed softly. "Don't get used to it." Later that evening, after the church was emptied and the lights dimmed, Steven walked through the sanctuary alone. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt full, like a room still echoing with all the truth that had been spoken inside it. He sat in the front row, looking up at the stage. So much had changed. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but slowly, like water smoothing the edges of stone. He pulled out his phone and opened the digital version of his journal. "God," he typed, "thank you for not letting me ignore that nudge. Thank you for breaking my pride with someone else's pain. Thank you for Julia, for her strength, her sacrifice, her grace, and thank you for letting me follow." He hit save, then leaned back, letting the stillness speak. But as always, the journey wasn't over. A few weeks later, Elevation Cares was contacted by a nonprofit organization that worked with trafficking survivors. They had heard about the Ruth Project and wanted to collaborate. They had 3 young women in urgent need of safe housing, girls who had been through unthinkable things and were barely clinging to hope. Steven brought the request to Julia privately. "This is beyond anything we've done so far," he said, "but I think God is asking us to stretch." Julia didn't hesitate. "Let's bring them home." That week, 3 rooms were prepared. Volunteers worked overtime. Counselors were brought in. Julia spent hours researching trauma-informed care, wanting to make sure they did this right. When the girls arrived, they barely spoke. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies tense. But Julia met them at the door like a mother welcoming lost daughters. "No pressure," she told them. "No expectations, just rest, just safety." It took time, weeks, before any of them began to open up. But slowly the cracks appeared. One girl started sketching. Another joined a prayer circle sitting in the back. The youngest began humming during worship nights. Steven visited often. He didn't preach or pry. He simply showed up, sat in the courtyard, and offered his quiet presence. He brought hot cocoa in the evenings, joked gently, listened intently. One night as he was leaving, the youngest of the 3, Maria, approached him. She was barely 16, her eyes too old for her age. "Is it true?" she asked. He stopped. "Is what true? That God still wants people like me?" Steven knelt down to her level, tears forming immediately. "It's especially true for people like you." She blinked, then nodded slowly, as if something inside her finally loosened. As Christmas approached, Elevation Church decided to host a celebration unlike any they'd ever done before. It wasn't going to be flashy or commercial. It would be a night of storytelling, worship, and testimony from those whose lives had been changed by Elevation Cares. They called it the Night of Light. The sanctuary was filled with candles, not spotlights. Instead of a stage filled with musicians, it was a circle of chairs with people from every walk of life. Addicts in recovery, widows who had found joy again, pastors who had admitted their burnout, mothers who had once felt invisible. And in the center of it all, Julia stood with a candle in her hand, the flame trembling but unwavering. "This light," she said softly, "was never meant to stay on a stage. It's meant to go into the shadows, into apartments where no one sees you cry, into shelters, into broken places. And if we have to follow each other into the dark to carry that light, then that's exactly what we'll do." One by one, candles were lit around the room. And Steven, standing in the back, knew with every part of his soul, this was what the church was always meant to be. The glow from the candles lasted long after the service ended. Families lingered in the sanctuary. Children whispered prayers beside their parents, and volunteers passed out warm drinks at the doors, cheeks red from the December cold. That night, Elevation Church didn't feel like a megachurch. It felt like a home, a place where brokenness was not hidden, but honored, where healing was ongoing, where Jesus walked not just in the sermons, but in the silence, the hugs, the shared tears. Julia stayed until the very end, walking through the aisles, picking up leftover programs, gently blowing out the candles one by one. Steven found her near the front, the soft glow of the last candle flickering against her face. "You did it," he said, voice low. She looked up, exhausted but at peace. "We did it." They walked toward the lobby together in silence. Outside, snow had begun to fall, just light flurries, but enough to dust the sidewalks and soften the edges of the night. Julia pulled her coat tighter, and Steven paused to look out the glass doors. "This year," he said, "has changed everything." Julia nodded. "I think it changed us first, and then everything else followed." They parted with a warm hug and promises to rest over the holidays. But rest, as Steven knew all too well, didn't always come easy. That night, as he lay in bed beside his wife Holly, he stared at the ceiling. Images from the past year spun through his mind like a slow reel. Julia praying over her mother. Tiana curled up on the bench, Maria asking if God still wanted her. The candles lighting up the sanctuary like stars. Holly rolled over and looked at him. "You okay?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, just overwhelmed, in a good way." "You've done good, babe." "No," he said softly. "We have. All of us. God did. She reached over and took his hand. And he's not done. The next morning, he awoke with a sense of urgency. It wasn't anxiety, it was clarity. He opened his journal again and wrote, "The miracle wasn't that I followed Julia. The miracle was that I stopped long enough to see what God was already doing through her. How many more people are doing holy work in silence, unnoticed and uncelebrated? That's who I want to find next." That day, he called a meeting with the Elevation staff. "I want a new initiative," he told them. "We're going to find the invisible servants, the ones in our city who are doing the kingdom's work in the shadows, without a platform, without a name, without applause." One staff member raised a brow. "How will we find them?" Steven smiled. "The same way I found Julia. We'll pay attention." They called it the Searchlight Project. Volunteers spread out across the city, visiting soup kitchens, sitting in on AA meetings, walking through apartment complexes, listening in hospitals. And slowly, stories began to emerge. A janitor who gave half his paycheck to feed his neighbors. A nurse who prayed over every patient under her breath. A teenager who taught ESL classes in her basement after school for immigrant children. Steven made it his mission to meet each one. Not to make them famous, not to exploit their stories, but to bless them, to thank them, to remind them they weren't unseen. Meanwhile, Julia continued to grow into her leadership role. She was no longer hesitant in meetings. She spoke with clarity, compassion, and boldness. People listened when she talked. They sought her wisdom, and most importantly, they trusted her, not because of a title, but because of her testimony. But underneath the growth, a new ache had begun to form. One afternoon, Steven found Julia sitting in her mother's old apartment, the one now used as a counseling room for new arrivals to the Ruth Project. She was alone, her eyes distant. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I think I need to leave," she said. Steven's chest tightened. "Leave Elevation?" She nodded slowly. "Not forever, just for a while. I've been pouring out so much, but I think I need time to be filled again. Time to be still, to grieve, to breathe." Steven didn't argue. He just sat beside her. "You taught me that rest isn't quitting," she added. "It's obedience." He smiled. "Then I'll support you however you need." She left that weekend, packed a small suitcase and headed for a quiet cabin in the mountains. No Wi-Fi, no ministry calls. Just her Bible, a few books, and her mother's journal. Steven cried when she left, quietly, alone in his office, because he knew what she meant to him. Not just as a leader, but as a mirror. A reminder of the voice he almost ignored that night. The voice that had led him into the most important transformation of his life. Over the following weeks, letters from Julia arrived in his mailbox. Handwritten, thoughtful, beautiful. One said, "I watched a deer walk past my cabin this morning. It didn't rush, it didn't panic, it just moved slowly, confidently. And I realized, I've spent most of my life sprinting. I think it's time I learned to walk with God, instead of always running ahead of Him." Another read, "Do you remember the night you found me? I do. Every day. I think God let you see me because He needed me to see myself again. Thank you for being willing to follow." Steven kept every letter, folded them neatly, tucked them into his journal, and on the back page he wrote, "She followed Grace into the fire, and I followed her. And we both found God waiting for us there." Weeks passed. The new year settled in slowly, like fresh snow blanketing an old road. Without Julia physically present, Elevation Care still moved forward, but there was a noticeable difference. Her absence was like a missing instrument in a familiar song. Everything still worked, but something vital was quieter. Steven kept up with her through her letters, reading each one with the reverence of Scripture. They weren't long, but they were layered, honest, sometimes raw, sometimes poetic. She was rediscovering herself, not as a caretaker or a leader, but simply as a daughter, as a child of God. Meanwhile, Steven threw himself into the next phase of the Searchlight Project. The stories they uncovered were humbling. He visited a man who swept the floors of a city bus depot for 20 years and used his lunch breaks to pray over the people he saw sleeping in the cold. Another was a retired teacher who spent her mornings packing bagged lunches for homeless teens and tucking handwritten scriptures into each one. But one story, in particular, changed him again. Her name was Denise. She was in her 60s, a quiet woman with a soft voice and silver curls. She had never stepped foot inside Elevation Church, yet for 10 years she had cared for dying neighbors in her rundown housing complex. She'd learn their medical needs, help with their errands, sit with them until their final breaths. No formal training, no organization behind her, just love. Steven met her on a cold Friday afternoon, seated in her tiny living room surrounded by old photos and secondhand furniture. "You do all this by yourself?" he asked, stunned. She smiled gently. "I'm never really by myself." "But why?" he pressed. "You don't get paid. You don't get recognition. Most people wouldn't even notice if you stopped." She looked down at her hands, calloused from years of care. "Because one day I'll stand before God, and I want him to say, 'You loved them well.' That's enough for me." Steven couldn't speak. He just nodded, heart pounding. As he drove home, the silence in his car felt different than usual. It wasn't empty. It was filled with reverence and conviction. He got home, walked straight to his journal and wrote, "Denise reminded me that the kingdom of God isn't always built by those on stages. It's often built by those in silence, in shadows, in suffering. Lord, help me never to forget that again." That Sunday, he opened his sermon not with scripture, but with Denise's story, and as he spoke, people wept, because they knew, deep down, they had been waiting for someone to remind them that quiet obedience mattered, that unseen faith was still faith. Meanwhile, up in the mountains, Julia stood on the edge of a frozen lake, bundled in layers, watching the sun rise over the white trees. She hadn't spoken to Steven in weeks, only letters, and yet, that morning, she felt his prayers, like a warmth in her chest, a whisper in the silence. She opened her mother's journal and reread an old entry. "One day, you'll be tired, my love, not just in your body but in your spirit. When that day comes, don't fight it. Let God carry you. Let him fill the places you've emptied in others." She closed the journal and let the tears fall freely, not from grief this time, but from gratitude, from healing. That afternoon she sat down and wrote another letter. "Dear Steven, it's snowing again. I've been watching it for hours. I used to hate silence, remember? I thought it meant something was wrong, but I'm starting to see it differently now. Silence can be sacred, healing, a pause between two parts of a song. Maybe that's what this season is, a holy pause. Tell the team I miss them. Tell the women at Ruth I think of them every day. And tell Tiana I still pray for her by name. I'm almost ready to come back, but not as the same person. When I return, I want to lead from overflow, not from exhaustion. Thank you for giving me the space to heal. With love, Julia." When Steven read the letter later that week, he held it to his chest for a moment before placing it with the others, and that night he stood on the church stage once again. But this time, he didn't preach a new message. Instead, he revisited an old one, the one from that very first Sunday after he followed Julia. He pulled out the same Bible, the same notes, and then looked at the crowd and said, "Tonight, I'm not here to give you something new. I'm here to remind you of what started all of this. One act of obedience, one moment of listening, one decision to follow a whisper." Wait, he paused, then added, "And if you're tired, truly tired, know that God sees you. You don't have to lead with strength. Sometimes the holiest thing you can do is rest." The room was quiet. Then someone in the back stood up. Then another, and another. Not to leave, not in protest, but in agreement, in shared understanding. They stood in reverence for a truth that had been so easy to forget. God moves in silence. God moves in small things. God moves in those who dare to stop and see. Julia returned in early spring. She didn't make a big announcement. There was no welcome back post, no stage moment. She simply walked through the doors of Elevation Church on a quiet Tuesday morning with a thermos of coffee in her hand and peace in her spirit. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway where she had once rushed between tasks, always chasing time. But now she walked slowly, intentionally, grounded. When Steven saw her through his office window, he didn't rush out. He waited, gave her space to come to him. When she finally stepped through the door, they didn't say much at first. He stood, she smiled. They hugged. A long, deep, healing kind of hug. "You're different," Steven said gently as they pulled apart. "I feel different," she replied. "Still me, but fuller, stronger, quieter on the inside." He gestured to the couch. "Want to sit?" She nodded, sinking into the familiar cushions as if they too remembered her. "I thought I would be afraid to come back," she admitted. "But I'm not. I miss this, the people, the purpose. But mostly, I missed the chance to see people again the way God showed me that night." Steven nodded, eyes soft. "You were never just a secretary, Julia. You've always been a shepherd." She smiled. "I think I believe that now." In the days that followed, Julia eased back into her role, not in the same capacity, but in a wiser, more sustainable way. She trained new team members, delegated tasks, and took time each week to simply be, to sit with people, to listen, to pray without a clock ticking in her head. One afternoon, she walked through the courtyard of the Ruth Project and found Maria, the youngest survivor they had taken in, sitting cross-legged with a Bible open on her lap. "Hey," Julia said gently. "What are you reading?" Maria looked up, her face brighter than Julia remembered. "Psalm 139. I like the part where it says, 'Even the darkness will not be dark to you.'" Julia sat beside her. "That verse saved me once." Maria nodded, then tilted her head. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever wish you could go back, before everything happened?" Julia thought for a moment. "Sometimes I miss my mom. I miss the way life felt simpler before I knew so much pain. But then I think, if I hadn't walked through all that, I wouldn't know what it means to see people the way God does. So no, I wouldn't go back. Not if it means losing what I've found on the other side." Maria smiled and leaned her head on Julia's shoulder. "You're kind of like my mom now," she whispered. Julia didn't reply. She just wrapped her arm around the girl and held her close. That evening, Steven hosted a small dinner at his home for the staff leaders of Elevation Cares. It was a simple meal, pasta, salad, warm bread, and yet it felt sacred, like communion. Stories flowed freely. Laughter rose. Tears came without apology. When the meal was over, Steven stood and raised his glass of sparkling cider. "I just want to say thank you," he said, "to all of you, for carrying people when I didn't see how heavy their burdens were, for following the voice of God when it didn't make sense, and to Julia, for being the kind of leader I pray to become." "Source," Julia blushed, looking down at her plate. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. "Yes," Steven replied, "I do." He looked around the table, locking eyes with each person. "The work we're doing, this isn't just ministry, it's warfare, and it's worship, and it's worth every ounce of energy we pour into it. But we have to keep reminding each other to rest, to refill, to go to the feet of Jesus before we go back to work." There were murmurs of agreement. A few nodded, tears in their eyes. After everyone left, Julia lingered behind to help clean up. As they washed dishes together, she turned to Steven. "Do you ever worry that the pressure will come back, that we'll slip into performance again?" Steven didn't answer right away. He scrubbed a plate, rinsed it, set it down. "Every day," he said, "but that's why we keep each other accountable. That's why we remember the story. Your story, our story. The night I followed you and found God waiting in a place I didn't expect." Julia looked at him, her voice soft. "It was never really about me." "No," Steven said. "It was about the God who sees, the God who follows us into the shadows, the God who refuses to leave us alone in the silence." They finished the dishes, turned off the lights, and as they stepped outside into the cool spring air, Julia looked up at the sky. "The stars are bright tonight," she said. Steven looked too. "Maybe that's what happens after a season of darkness," he replied. "We start noticing the light again." They stood there for a long time, quiet, content, changed. The journey wasn't over. There were still broken hearts to comfort, stories to hear, women to rescue, pastors to encourage. But for now, in that peaceful moment, They simply stood in the quiet glow of grace, and somewhere deep inside both of them, a new prayer began to form, not for success, not for growth, but for the courage to keep seeing, to keep following, to keep loving the ones the world forgets. Spring gave way to early summer, and with it came new faces to the Ruth Project, each one carrying their own story, each one wrapped in silent pain and fragile hope. Julia had returned to the rhythm of the ministry, but this time, she didn't lead from the front. She walked alongside others, quietly empowering, gently guiding. She smiled more, she laughed more, and when she prayed, there was a stillness in her words that felt like rain on dry earth. One morning, as the sun poured in through the chapel windows at Elevation, Steven stood beside a young woman named Camilla. She was new to the church, only 17, rescued from a dangerous domestic situation, and now beginning to speak again after weeks of silence. Her eyes were guarded, but behind them was the unmistakable flicker of someone who wanted to believe, who needed to believe, that safety and love weren't just words, but real things. "She doesn't talk to many people," Julia had told Steven, "but I think she might talk to you." So he sat with her, day after day, sometimes in silence, sometimes reading scripture, sometimes simply sharing stories from his own life, the kind of stories he used to think didn't belong on a pulpit, the ones about failure, doubt, pain. Camilla listened. Then one day, she finally spoke. "Do you think God gets tired of me?" Steven's eyes welled. "Never. He's not like us. He doesn't run out of patience, or love, or mercy." She looked down at her hands. "I've done things I'm ashamed of." He nodded slowly. "So have I." Camilla blinked. "You're a pastor. And I'm also a man who's hurt people, who's missed God's voice, who almost didn't follow someone he placed right in front of me. I've made choices I regret. But grace, real grace, it rewrites every line." She was quiet again, but her breathing slowed. Her shoulders relaxed. The wall began to crumble, piece by piece. That afternoon, Steven met with Julia in the garden behind the Ruth Project. Roses were blooming, the air thick with the perfume of lavender and new life. "She spoke to me," he said. Julia looked up, surprised. "Camilla?" He nodded. "Asked if God gets tired of her." Julia closed her eyes for a moment. "They all ask that in their own way." Steven sighed. "And I keep thinking about how many people in our pews feel the same way. They dress up their wounds, smile through worship, take notes during sermons, and still wonder if God's patience ran out on them." Julia pulled a small notebook from her bag and handed it to him. "That's why I've been working on this." He opened the notebook and found pages of handwritten devotionals, each one based on the stories and prayers shared by the women at the Ruth Project. The title on the first page read, "Grace Never Stops Knocking." Steven flipped through, stunned. "This is beautiful. I want to give it to them," Julia said. "Not as a product, not even as a gift, just a reminder that grace is persistent and gentle and near." Steven nodded. "Let's print them. Quietly, anonymously, we'll slip one under every door in the Ruth Project. No names, no pressure, just light." That night, as the sun set over the city, volunteers quietly placed the devotionals into each room. And one by one, the women who had once come there with nothing opened the little books and felt seen. It wasn't a grand sermon, it wasn't an altar call, but it was love, unforced, unspoken, undeniable. Camilla found hers in the early hours of the morning. She opened it and read the first line. "You are not your past. You are not your shame. You are not too far gone. You are not forgotten." She pressed her fingers to the page, then closed her eyes. Outside her door, Julia stood silently, praying. Back at church, Steven prepared for the Sunday service, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something else needed to happen first. Something quieter, deeper. So he called a few team members together. "We need a space in the church that's just for listening," he said. "Not counseling, not preaching, just listening. A room where people can come, sit across from someone and say the things they don't know how to say out loud." They looked at him puzzled. "Like confession?" "Not confession," he said. "Compassion. He called it the listening room. They cleared out an unused office, filled it with warm lighting, soft chairs, gentle music. Volunteers were trained not to offer advice unless asked. Just presence. Just a ministry of ears and open hearts. The first week, only a few people came. By the second, it was full. By the third, there was a wait list. Steven took a shift each Wednesday morning. He didn't wear his pastor's badge. He didn't quote scripture unless someone asked. He simply sat and listened to pain, to stories, to confessions, to questions no one dared ask from the pews. One man in his 50s came in and said, "I've never told anyone I was abused as a kid, not even my wife. I just needed to say it out loud to someone." Another woman whispered, "I'm tired of being the strong one. I want someone to be strong for me." Steven listened and wept with them. And every time someone left that room, they didn't leave fixed or solved. They left lighter. And slowly, Steven realized something profound. Following Julia that night had led him into the heart of Jesus in a way years of preaching never had. Summer deepened, and the city shimmered under long golden evenings and cicada song nights. The listening room became the soul of the church in a quiet way. It wasn't advertised. There were no social media posts or banners. But word spread, through whispered testimonies, through tear-stained conversations in parking lots, through one broken heart telling another, "You'll be safe there." One morning, Julia walked into the church and found a small note left on her desk. No name, no handwriting she recognized, just a short message on a folded piece of paper. "Thank you for seeing me, for not turning away. I didn't know grace had a face until I saw yours." She sat with the note in her hand for a long time. Then, carefully, she placed it inside her Bible, tucking it between the pages of Isaiah 58, the passage about loosing the chains of injustice, setting the oppressed free, sharing bread with the hungry. That afternoon, she visited the Ruth Project, walking its hallways, praying silently for each room. Tiana had just completed a job interview. Maria was preparing to apply to college. Camilla had begun drawing again, sketching portraits of the women around her, capturing their resilience in pencil lines and shading. "Your sketches are getting really good," Julia told her. Camilla smiled shyly. "I think it's how I pray." Julia nodded. "Then keep praying." Outside the community garden, once a patch of hard dirt, was now full of herbs, tomatoes, wildflowers. Some of the women called it Eden, and in a way it was. Not perfect, but sacred, restored, holy in its healing. Meanwhile, Steven had begun writing again, not sermons, but stories. He had been waking early before sunrise, sitting on his back porch with a cup of coffee and a notebook, chronicling the lives that had touched his own. He didn't plan to publish them. He wrote for himself, for God, for the sake of remembering. In one entry he wrote, "I used to think the pulpit was the most powerful place in the church. Now I think it's the hallway where someone finally says, 'I need help,' or the office where a man whispers, 'I don't think God hears me anymore,' or the garden where a girl who once feared her own voice says, 'This is how I pray.' That's where the kingdom lives." He closed the journal, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Later that week, a woman named Grace, a soft-spoken, middle-aged mother of 3, entered the listening room. She sat across from Steven, eyes cast downward. "I don't know where to start," she said. "You don't have to start anywhere," Steven replied. "You can just be here." She looked up, and her voice cracked. "I haven't said this out loud in years, but I don't think I believe anymore. Not in the way I used to. I read my Bible. I come to church, but I feel nothing." Steven didn't rush to answer. He let the silence breathe between them. "I think," he said finally, "that kind of honesty is the beginning of real faith. The kind that doesn't perform. The kind that shows up anyway." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I keep praying for God to show up." "He already has," Steven said softly. "You're here. I'm here. And he's in this room." She nodded slowly, something loosening inside her chest. After she left, Steven sat alone for a while, praying not with words, but with presence. And once again he thought of Julia, of the long road they had walked, of the voice that had nudged him that night, the one he had almost ignored. That night he visited the Ruth Project and found Julia sitting on the steps, watching the sunset turn the sky into soft gold. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting beside her, "about how we got here." Julia smiled faintly. "Me too." He looked out at the horizon. "What if that night had gone differently? What if I hadn't followed you?" Julia didn't answer immediately. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "I think God would have found another way, but I'm glad he chose that one, because I think I needed to be seen, and you needed to see." Steven nodded. "You were the miracle I didn't know I needed." They sat in silence for a long time. No words, no pressure. Just the peace that comes when two people who have walked through fire together finally stand on the other side and still believe in the God who never left them alone in it. Behind them, laughter echoed from the garden. Inside, worship music played quietly from a speaker in the hallway. And for the first time in a long time, Steven felt like the church wasn't just a building, or a service, or a brand. It was a body, a heart, a family, a place where a pastor could learn how to listen, where a broken woman could learn how to lead, where a girl with scars could teach others how to pray through drawing, and where silence was not empty, but holy. Summer slowly faded into fall again, and with it came the one-year mark since Julia's mother had passed. The memory of that night, of the cold, the whisper in Steven's spirit, the rundown apartment lit only by sacrificial love, was still vivid. It had become a quiet anniversary in both their hearts, not one marked with public events or special services, but with reflection, with gratitude, and with awe at how far God had carried them. Julia spent the day at the garden. She didn't tell anyone why. She simply arrived at dawn with a folded blanket, a notebook, and her mother's favorite scarf around her neck. She sat in silence, listening to the birds, the breeze, the gentle rustling of life all around her. And in that quiet, she felt her mother near, not in a mystical way, but in the very essence of everything she now carried. She opened the notebook and began to write. "Mom, it's been a year since I last held your hand, but I see you everywhere, in the courage of the women who walk through these doors, in the laughter that fills the rooms you once knew as quiet and broken, in the little things, a warm blanket, a whispered prayer, a second chance. You taught me how to love when it hurt, how to show up even when it cost everything. I didn't understand it before, but I do now. I miss you, but I'm still walking, and I'm not walking alone." She closed the book and wiped her eyes, just as Steven appeared on the path, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be here," he said. Julia accepted the cup with a small smile. Some things don't need to be said out loud. They sat together on the grass, letting the moment stretch long and wide. There was no pressure to speak, no sermons to preach, no plans to make. Just breath, just peace. "You remember what you told me that night?" Steven asked eventually. Julia looked over. "Which part?" "You said you were drowning." Her eyes lowered. "I did. I think about that a lot," he said. "How many people are still drowning right under our noses? How close I came to missing you." Julia nodded. "And how one person noticing can change everything." They sipped their coffee, the morning sun warming their faces. Steven turned toward her. "I've been praying about what's next, for the church, for the ministry, for you." Julia raised a brow, curious. "What's God saying?" Steven hesitated, then smiled. "That maybe we stop trying to build what's next and start tending what's now. Maybe the goal isn't bigger. Maybe it's deeper." Julia grinned. "That sounds like something you'd say in a sermon." "I probably will," he laughed. "But first I needed to say it to you." Later that evening, Julia hosted a small dinner in the main room of the Ruth Project. Nothing fancy, just homemade soup, warm bread, soft lighting, and the presence of women who had walked through storms and found shelter. Each woman took a turn sharing something they were grateful for. Simple things, a full night of sleep, a safe place to cry, the ability to laugh again. When it came time for Camilla to speak, she stood nervously, holding one of her drawings. It was a portrait of Julia, but not just her face. It was Julia, sitting on the steps of the old apartment, holding her mother's hand, her eyes full of sorrow and strength. Behind her, the outline of a cross shone faintly through a window. The title of the drawing, scrawled in the corner in delicate handwriting, read, "When God Followed Me Home." The room fell silent. Julia blinked hard. "Camilla, this is... I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "It's how I see you. It's how I see God now. Not far away, not angry. Just someone who follows. Someone who doesn't give up." Julia stood and hugged her tightly, and no one in the room could hold back tears. Later that night, Steven stopped by and saw the framed drawing sitting on Julia's desk. "She's talented," he said, studying the lines. "She's a survivor," Julia replied, "and a teacher. They all are." Steven nodded slowly. "I want to start something new. A fund. For education, therapy, creative expression. For women like Camilla who need tools to keep growing." Julia smiled. "What will you call it?" He looked at the drawing again, then said almost in a whisper, "The Followers Fund." They launched it quietly that fall. No flashy campaign, no celebrity endorsements, just stories, truth, faces, and the drawing, reprinted on every envelope. In the first week alone, the fund raised enough to cover scholarships for 10 women. A month later, Elevation began offering creative workshops, writing, painting, music, counseling training. Camilla enrolled in every art class she could. Maria signed up to mentor incoming girls. Tiana began studying to become a recovery coach. One small act, one night of obedience, and the waves were still moving outward. Back in his journal, Steven wrote, "God didn't just teach me how to lead again. He taught me how to follow, how to notice, how to believe that sometimes the holiest road is the one that starts with sitting still long enough to care." The first graduation from the Ruth Project took place on a crisp October afternoon. It wasn't the kind of graduation that came with caps and gowns, no formal speeches, no pomp or ceremony. But to those who gathered in the courtyard, staff, mentors, volunteers, and the women themselves, it was more sacred than any stage or diploma ever could be. There were 6 women in total. Each one had come through fire. Each one had been reborn through tears, truth, and trust. Julia stood before them in a circle of folding chairs, holding a single candle. "This candle," she said softly, "represents the flame that tried to go out in you, but didn't. You kept it burning, even when it flickered, even when the wind was strong. And now you carry that light into the world, not as someone who has to prove anything, but as someone who has already overcome." Tiana stepped forward first, tears streaking her cheeks. She was the one everyone thought might not make it through. But here she stood, steady, radiant, alive. "I didn't think I deserved a second chance," she said, "but this place didn't ask for my worthiness. It just welcomed me. And now, I want to spend the rest of my life doing the same for others." Camilla came next, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. She didn't speak much, but instead handed Julia a new drawing. It was the Ruth Project building, surrounded by women holding candles, the windows glowing with golden light. In the corner, written in her now familiar handwriting, "We were never lost, just waiting to be found." Julia clutched the drawing to her chest. When it was over, the women embraced each other, laughed, cried, shared stories and food. They danced barefoot on the soft grass while worship music played softly from a small speaker. It wasn't flashy, but it was holy. Steven stood back, watching it all with quiet awe. He'd preached to thousands. He'd stood on some of the biggest stages in the world. But nothing he had ever done, not a single sermon, had moved him the way this moment did. Later, as the courtyard emptied and the last of the folding chairs were stacked, Julia found him leaning against the garden fence. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "For listening," she replied. "For following. For not trying to fix everything, but just being there." Steven looked down, humble. "I didn't know what I was doing back then." Julia smiled. "Maybe that's what made it real." He nodded. "I think about that night often. How scared I was. How wrong it could have gone. But it didn't," Julia said. Because you didn't let fear win." There was a pause. Then she added, "I think God's proud of you, Stephen, not because of elevation, not because of sermons or influence, but because you chose compassion when it cost you something." He looked at her, eyes filled with emotion. "And I'm proud of you, because you chose truth when it could have broken you." They stood in the fading sunlight, two people who had been changed forever by grace, not the kind written in books, but the kind found in hospital rooms, dirty apartments, and silent gardens. The next Sunday, Stephen took the pulpit again. He wasn't wearing his usual button-up. He looked more relaxed, more real. And when he stepped up to speak, he didn't carry notes. He carried Camilla's drawing. "I used to measure ministry in numbers," he said. "Attendance, reach, online views, influence." He held up the picture. "Now I measure it in stories, in eyes that shine again, in hands that stop trembling, in women who once believed they were worthless, now standing with fire in their souls. I measure it in the quiet moments, the ones that don't make headlines but move heaven." The room was silent. Stephen continued, "A year ago, I followed someone I love because something in my spirit told me something was wrong. I didn't go to fix her. I went to see her. And God opened my eyes to everything I'd been missing." He paused. "And I want to ask you today, who in your life is silently drowning? Who is waiting for someone to notice, not to rescue them, but to remind them they're not invisible?" A man in the front row wiped his eyes. A mother clutched her daughter's hand. A teenager looked up for the first time all morning. "Maybe the most spiritual thing you can do this week isn't another Bible study," Stephen said. "Maybe it's slowing down long enough to see. Maybe it's walking someone home." After service, dozens came forward, not to ask for prayer, but to ask for purpose, to ask how they could serve, how they could see. Stephen stood beside Julia in the lobby, quietly answering questions, hugging those who cried, pointing people toward the garden, the listening room, the support circles. And when the church emptied out again, when the lights dimmed and the music faded, Stephen turned to Julia and whispered something he hadn't said before. "I think you saved me." Julia looked at him, eyes wide. He nodded slowly. "You reminded me what it's all really for." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "No. You let yourself be changed. That's something only you and God could do together." They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The air between them was filled with everything they had learned, lost, and found again. And somewhere in the stillness of that Sunday night, Stephen opened his journal and wrote one final line before closing it for the evening. "1 year ago, I followed Julia. I thought I was protecting her. But really, God was rescuing me." Winter arrived early that year. Snow came before Christmas, blanketing Charlotte in a soft silence that made even the busiest parts of the city slow down. The chill in the air brought with it a new kind of stillness, a pause between everything that had happened and everything that was still unfolding. Stephen sat by the large window in his study, sipping tea instead of coffee for once. The steam curled up into the air like a prayer. He had spent the morning reading over the old journal entries from the past year, the ones that chronicled everything from that first night following Julia to the birth of the Ruth Project, the Listening Room, and the Followers Fund. So much had changed. He closed the journal, set it gently on the table beside him, and looked out at the falling snow. "What now, Lord?" he whispered in the quiet. "What's next?" There was no booming answer, just the wind tapping against the glass. But in his spirit, Stephen felt something he had grown to recognize over the past year. The nudge, the subtle, holy push that didn't demand action, but invited attention. So he waited. Later that afternoon, he walked into the church and found Julia decorating a small tree in the Ruth Project's common room. She was wrapping a string of tiny golden lights around the branches, her face soft with memory and peace. "Looks good," Stephen said. She turned, surprised, smiling. "It's our first Christmas tree here." He looked around the room. Stockings were being painted by the women. Cookies baked in the background, soft carols playing low from a speaker on the shelf. "You've created a home," he said. Julia nodded. "We all did." She stepped back from the tree, admiring it. "You know what I think the miracle really was?" "What?" "That night. You didn't just follow me. You saw me. You didn't look away. I think people go their whole lives waiting to be seen like that." Steven stepped closer. "And now, because of you, dozens of women are being seen every single day." She looked at him. "And what about you? How are you doing?" Steven paused. It wasn't the kind of question people asked him often. He was usually the one asking. But now here it was, genuine, unguarded. "I'm tired," he admitted, "but in a good way. Like after a long journey where you know you've finally arrived somewhere that matters." Julia nodded. "I think that's wholly tired." He smiled. "I think you're right." She walked to the shelf and pulled down a wrapped box. "We were saving this for Christmas Eve," she said, "but I want you to have it now." He took the box, carefully unwrapping it. Inside was a framed photo. It was a picture of that very first night, taken by a volunteer who had quietly documented the renovations of the old apartment. In the photo, Julia knelt beside her mother, holding her hand. The room was dimly lit, but there was a peace in her face, a sacred strength that shone through the shadows. "I didn't even know this picture existed," he whispered. "I didn't either," Julia said. "But when I saw it, I knew it had to be yours." Steven stared at it for a long time. The moment it captured wasn't glamorous. It wasn't posed. But it was everything. The beginning, the breaking, the blessing. "Thank you," he said, voice cracking. Julia reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for not walking away." They stood together in that warm room filled with light and laughter while outside snow continued to fall. That Christmas Eve, Elevation Church held a candlelight service unlike any before. There were songs and scripture, yes, but also testimonies, stories, faces. The entire service was led by voices the congregation had come to know through the Ruth Project and the Listening Room. Tiana spoke of second chances. Maria read a poem she had written about hope. Camilla unveiled a mural she had painted in secret, one that stretched across the back wall of the sanctuary. It showed a path winding through dark woods with small lanterns illuminating the way, and at the end of the path stood a cross, not towering or distant, but close, and surrounded by people. People who were smiling, people who were healing, people who looked like them. When Steven took the stage at the end, he didn't preach. He simply stood in the light of the candles, the mural behind him, and said, "We are not here tonight to celebrate perfection. We are here to honor a God who entered our imperfection, who walks through our pain, who follows us when we don't know how to ask for help, and who teaches us, again and again, how to follow him in return." The congregation stood in quiet reverence. One by one, they lit their candles, and as the sanctuary glowed, Steven looked out over the crowd, over Julia, over the women of the Ruth Project, over the families who had once been strangers and were now family. And in the deepest part of his soul he knew, this was what he had been made for. Not the platform, not the spotlight, but this, the ministry of seeing, the courage to follow, the miracle of being interrupted by grace. The new year came quietly, no fireworks, no big declarations. Just a slow dawn over a city still blanketed in soft snow. And in the heart of Elevation Church, something had shifted, not in size or numbers, but in spirit. It was as though the soul of the church had taken a deep breath and finally found its rhythm again. Steven found himself preaching less about outcomes and more about presence. His sermons were rooted in the kind of truth that comes from lived experience, the kind you can't manufacture or rehearse. People didn't just listen, they leaned in. Meanwhile, the Ruth Project began preparing for a new season of intake. More women were arriving, some young and timid, some older and hardened by years of survival. The staff was ready, the volunteers were trained, and yet Julia felt something stirring inside her. She stood in her office one morning, looking at the framed photo of her and her mother. The memory still ached, but the ache had changed. It was no longer sharp with grief. It had become a kind of sacred weight, something she carried with reverence, not sorrow. She opened her journal and began to write. It's been over a year, and still, I hear her voice sometimes when I speak to these women. I think that's what legacy really is. Not what we build, but who we build into. I carry her in every prayer, every whispered encouragement, every hand I hold in the middle of someone else's breaking. She closed the journal as a knock came at the door. It was Maria, holding a small envelope. "You got mail." Julia smiled. "Thanks, sweetheart." When she opened it, she found a handwritten letter from one of the pastors in Steven's national mentoring circle, a man she'd never met. He wrote, "I heard your story. I watched the video of the mural reveal. I wanted you to know. Your courage helped me admit I needed help. I stepped down from the pulpit for the first time in 20 years. Not because I lost faith, but because I needed to find it again. I'm in counseling now, and I'm learning how to be loved without performing. Thank you." Julia folded the letter, tears stinging her eyes. She stepped outside and walked to the edge of the garden, now dormant under frost, but still full of promise. Steven was there, pacing slowly with his phone tucked in his coat pocket. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it, then looked up at her. This is it, isn't it?" he said softly. "What is?" "This is how the kingdom grows. One heart healed, who turns around and gives someone else permission to heal." Julia nodded, her voice tight. "Like echoes," he smiled. "Exactly. Echoes of obedience." Later that evening, Steven stood in the sanctuary after everyone had left. The lights were low, the room empty except for him, and the sound of distant wind outside the windows. He walked slowly down the aisle, letting his hands brush against the backs of the chairs. So many stories, so many silent prayers, so many people who had been changed because one woman was brave enough to break open. He walked to the front row and sat in Julia's usual seat, letting the stillness wrap around him. What if I had never followed her, he thought. But he already knew the answer. He would still be preaching, still leading, still doing good. But he wouldn't be here, not really. Not in this deep, soul-level knowing of God's mercy and movement. He pulled out his phone and sent Julia a message. "You changed the way I see everything. I just wanted you to know." Her response came a few minutes later. "God changed us both, but I'm grateful we didn't miss it." That weekend, Elevation Church launched a new initiative, quietly, humbly. It was called The Table. Not a program, not a campaign, just a concept. Small gatherings where people came together, not to study or serve, but simply to share, to eat, to listen, to see and be seen. Steven and Julia hosted the first one together in the church basement. They lit candles, they set out bread and soup and pitchers of water, and people came. Not just church members, neighbors, teachers, nurses, janitors, a few homeless friends from the area who had never walked into a church before. There were no expectations, just chairs and stories. A man stood up with trembling hands and said, "I haven't sat at a table with people in over a year. I forgot what it felt like to be invited." A woman with 2 small children whispered, "This is the first meal I've eaten where I didn't feel like a burden." Steven didn't lead the night. Julia didn't direct it. The room led itself. The Holy Spirit moved through laughter, through quiet conversation, through warm bread and open hearts. And as people slowly began to leave, Julia turned to Steven and said, "Maybe this is what the church always should have been. A table first, a pulpit second." Steven smiled. "I think you just wrote next week's sermon." They cleaned up together, quietly, content, and as they walked to their cars in the cold night air, Steven looked up at the stars. He remembered something Camilla had once said. "I didn't know grace had a face until I saw yours." He didn't feel worthy of that. But he knew it wasn't about worthiness. It was about willingness. The willingness to follow, to see, to stop, to stay. And as he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, he whispered, "Thank you, God, for chasing me down with someone else's heartbreak." The following week, a snowstorm swept through Charlotte. Church services were moved online, and the Ruth Project went into quiet lockdown mode, with staff staying overnight to ensure the women were safe, warm, and cared for. The storm, though disruptive, brought with it a rare stillness, an unplanned Sabbath. Steven stayed home for the first full weekend in months. Not to write, not to plan, just to be. He sat by the fireplace with his family, played board games with his kids, listened to old worship albums with Holly. And at night, after everyone went to bed, he sat in silence with God. "What's next, Lord?" The answer wasn't in a vision or a voice, but in a single memory that kept resurfacing. The moment Julia opened the door to her mother's apartment and let him in. That act, so simple, so human, had opened far more than a door. It had cracked open his understanding of ministry, of leadership, of love. He opened his journal again and wrote, "The greatest breakthroughs don't begin with sermons. They begin with invitations, with knock-knock moments, when someone risks being seen and someone else chooses not to look away. Lord, keep making me brave enough to knock and humble enough to enter." At the Ruth Project, Julia watched the storm from the front window. Camilla sat beside her, drawing in her sketchbook. A few women gathered in the common room, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea. It felt more like a family than a shelter, more like home than a ministry. Camilla suddenly looked up. "You think the storm's a bad thing?" Julia tilted her head. "No. Sometimes storms force us to stop, to sit, to listen." Camilla smiled. "Like when Pastor Steven followed you." Julia nodded slowly. "Exactly like that." The next morning, the snow stopped falling, but the city remained quiet, blanketed in stillness. Julia walked out to the courtyard alone, boots crunching in the white powder. She stood there for a moment, letting the cold sting her skin, letting the quiet speak. Then she dropped to her knees and began to pray. Not with words she had planned, not with eloquence, just honesty. "Thank you, God, for the pain that broke me open, for the silence that became sacred, for the night you sent someone to follow me, not to save me, but to see me. I didn't know I could be found there. I didn't know you were already waiting." Her breath fogged the air, and then, as she knelt in the snow, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Just peace, just presence, just the gentle whisper of God saying, "I'm still here." Back at the church, Stephen received a message from one of the leaders of another large congregation across the country. They had read about the Ruth Project, watched the sermon clips, heard the testimonies, and now they wanted to build something similar in their city. He called Julia immediately. "They want to model the Ruth Project," he said. "Not copy it, just learn from it." Julia was quiet on the other end. Then she said, "Only if we show them everything. Not just the success, the pain too, the process, the nights we didn't know if it would work, the tears, the stories." "Of course," Stephen said. "That's the only way it's real." Over the following weeks, they began mentoring that church team. Zoom calls, detailed notes, personal visits. Julia was hesitant at first. She never liked the spotlight, but she told the truth, every time. And it was her truth, not her strategies, that began unlocking something in the leaders listening. One night after a long call, one of the women on the team said, "I thought we were calling to learn how to build a program, but I think what we're learning is how to build a heart." Julia smiled. "Then you're on the right track." By spring, 3 new Ruth projects were in the works. Different cities, different faces, same heartbeat. Survivors turned leaders. Grace without performance. Tables instead of stages. Light in the dark. Back in Charlotte, Stephen prepared to step away from the pulpit for a few weeks. Not because he was burned out, but because he wasn't afraid to rest anymore. He gathered the staff. "I'm taking a sabbatical," he said. "Not because I'm tired, but because I've seen what happens when we lead from overflow, not survival." Everyone nodded, supportive, grateful. He turned to Julia. "Will you preach the week I'm gone?" She looked stunned. "Me?" "You've already been preaching," he said, "with your life. Now I want you to put it into words." She didn't answer right away, but that night she wrote her first message. It began with this line, "I used to believe silence was the absence of God. Now I know it's where He waits for us to stop pretending." And when she finally stood behind the pulpit, looking out over the church that had once only seen her as a name on an office door, she didn't feel fear. She felt faith, because now she knew the truth. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to invite, to knock on the doors of weary hearts, to remind them that grace had followed her, and would follow them too. The sanctuary was full that Sunday morning, but it wasn't buzzing with excitement. It was humming with anticipation, the kind that comes not from hype, but from hunger. People had heard the announcement Julia would be speaking. Some came out of curiosity, others out of deep respect. Most came because they had seen her life and trusted that whatever she would say, it would be real. Steven sat quietly in the front row, hands folded, heart pounding. Not out of nervousness for her, but out of reverence for the moment. He knew this was holy ground. Julia stepped up to the platform, not with swagger or show, but with quiet authority. She wore no makeup beyond a little mascara. Her clothes were simple. She carried no notes, just a small Bible and a fragile kind of peace that filled the room. She took a long breath and looked out over the crowd. "I'm not here to preach," she began. "I'm here to tell the truth." Silence. She opened her Bible and read aloud. Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Her voice was steady, but soft, vulnerable, not theatrical. "I didn't believe this verse for a long time," she said, "because I didn't feel saved. I didn't feel seen. I felt like I had to keep performing to prove I was worthy of being loved. At home, at work, even here, in this church." She paused. "Then one night someone followed me. You could hear a pin drop. I was angry at first, embarrassed, exposed. But I didn't realize that what was happening that night wasn't invasion. It was intervention. God was intervening in my silent collapse." People shifted in their seats. Some began to cry. "See, I thought I was strong because I never asked for help. But strength without surrender isn't strength. It's isolation. And isolation is where shame breeds." She stepped down from the platform and began to walk slowly across the stage. "My mother died in a room no one wanted to see. In poverty. In pain. But she died knowing that love had followed her there. That she wasn't forgotten. That her daughter had found a church brave enough to look past perfection and see real people." A woman in the middle row began to sob quietly. Julia's eyes landed on her. Then she looked across the room at others, men, women, teenagers, some who had come through the listening room, others through the Ruth Project, many who were still silently wondering if their pain disqualified them from belonging. "It doesn't matter how put together you are," she said. "It doesn't matter what role you serve, how many verses you've memorized, or how strong your faith once was. God is not looking for performance. He's looking for presence. Your presence, your honesty. Your open hands." She raised her hand slowly. "This is how I used to live." Her fingers curled into a tight fist, closed, controlling, afraid. Then she opened it. "This is how I live now. Not because I figured everything out, but because I finally let God in, and I let someone see me." She walked back to the podium and looked out once more. "And that's all I want to offer you today. The courage to be seen, to stop running, to stop hiding in busyness or pride or theology that's lost its tenderness." Her voice softened again. "Because grace still follows people. It followed me, and it's following you." She closed her Bible and stepped down from the platform. The room remained still for a moment, stunned not by eloquence, but by raw truth. Then slowly, one by one, people began to stand, not to applaud but to honor, to witness, to say, "We heard you and we see you." Steven rose with tears in his eyes, hands at his sides. He didn't walk up to the stage. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because something far bigger than any sermon had just taken place. After the service, people lingered. Dozens came to Julia, not to praise her, but to confess, to ask for prayer, to ask how to start again, and she listened to each one like they were the only person in the world. Later, she found Steven in the courtyard. He was standing beneath the oak tree where they had shared so many conversations over the past year. He turned as she approached, his face shining with tears and pride. "You just rewrote the meaning of church," he said. Julia chuckled gently, brushing hair from her face. "I just told the truth. And that," Steven replied, "is what people have been starving for." They sat on the bench beneath the tree as a warm breeze rustled the leaves overhead. "You know," Julia said after a long silence, If you had told me 2 years ago I'd be preaching in front of the whole church, I would have laughed in your face." Steven grinned. "If you had told me I'd learn more from my secretary than from seminary, I'd have said the same." She shook her head. "Don't call me that anymore." He tilted his head. "What should I call you?" She looked at him with eyes full of light. "Just Julia, daughter of a good God and a follower of grace." They sat in that peace for a long time. No agenda, no rush. Just two people who had walked through fire and come out not burned, but bright. Spring returned, not just to the earth, but to the spirit of the church. The flowers in the courtyard bloomed again. Tulips, lavender, hyacinth, and so did the people. The Ruth Project had expanded to include workshops, art therapy sessions, and mentorship training. The listening room was now booked weeks in advance. And the table, those humble, sacred dinners, had become the heartbeat of the community, rotating from home to home, street to street, like a modern-day book of Acts. But more than anything, what had changed most was how people saw each other. No more polite nods that skipped past the eyes. No more smiles that masked wounds. Now the church had learned to pause, to notice, to stay. Steven, after returning from his brief sabbatical, found himself leading differently. He no longer aimed for applause at the end of a sermon. He looked for silence, for stillness, for that holy space when people didn't rush to respond, because something deeper had been stirred. And Julia, well, Julia had become a name that echoed in rooms far beyond Charlotte. Other churches began inviting her to speak. Conferences reached out. Authors asked her to write, but she wasn't interested in platform. She told Steven one day, "I don't want to be famous. I want to be faithful." He smiled. "That's exactly why your voice carries weight." One afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of the Ruth Project during a building inspection, Steven paused and pointed to the corner room, now repurposed as a creative space with paint-splattered floors and sun-drenched windows. "That used to be where your mother slept," he said. Julia nodded slowly. "I know. I think about it every day." She stepped into the room, ran her fingers along the windowsill. "There's so much light now," she whispered. "It's like God refused to let this place stay dark." Steven stood beside her. "I think your mother would be proud." Julia smiled faintly. "She'd probably tell me to stop talking and get back to work." They both laughed. Then, from the hallway came the sound of voices. Two new women arriving, their belongings in hand, eyes uncertain. Julia turned to Steven. "I need to go welcome them." He nodded. "Of course." She started down the hall, then paused and looked back. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For not needing to lead everything," she said. "For letting others rise." He watched her go, a quiet smile on his face. He remembered the first day she walked into his office, organized, efficient, unreadable. He had no idea then who she really was, what she carried, what she would become. Back at the main church building, Steven entered the sanctuary after hours. The room was empty, lights dimmed, air still. He walked to the altar, knelt down, and prayed. Not for a new vision, not for church growth, not even for himself. He prayed for the ones no one had noticed yet. "God," he whispered, "send us the ones who are breaking, the ones who won't say it out loud, the ones who think they have to hold it all together. We're ready to follow them now. We're ready to listen." The next morning, a man named Brian walked into the listening room, late 40s, divorced, quiet. He wore a collared shirt like armor, sat down across from Steven, and stared at the floor for a long time before speaking. "I've been leading men's ministry at my church for 10 years, he said. "I've told everyone else how to be strong, how to fight temptation, how to lead their homes." Steven waited. "But last week," Brian continued, "I drove to a motel with a bottle of pills in my hand. I didn't take them. I don't know why. Maybe because I saw that video of the woman who talked about being followed." He looked up. "Was that you?" Steven nodded. "That was Julia." Brian swallowed hard. "I think I need someone to follow me now, because I don't think I can keep pretending." Steven leaned in. "You don't have to pretend here," he said. "We'll walk with you, all the way." Brian began to cry. Not softly, but the kind of weeping that came from years of silent ache finally given space. And in that moment, Steven saw it again. The cycle of grace, the echo of obedience, the miracle of one act of listening rippling outward through time, catching people who hadn't even fallen yet, and offering them a place to land. Later that night, he told Julia the story. She listened with tears in her eyes. "I wish my mom could see this," she said. Steven looked at her. "She does," he said. They stood in silence under the stars, the same stars that had shone over that apartment the night everything began. Only now they were brighter, not because the sky had changed, but because they had. 6 months later, Elevation Church gathered for a special service, not to launch a new initiative or celebrate a program, but to mark a moment that began not with a plan, but with a whisper, not with a sermon, but with a step. The night Pastor Steven Furtick followed his secretary. Word had spread far and wide. The sanctuary was full. Overflow rooms had been set up. But Steven wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was thinking about Julia, about her mother, about the apartment, about how God had used one simple act of obedience to shift the foundation of his life and ministry forever. The service opened with worship, soft, reverent, no flashing lights, no fanfare, just voices lifted in quiet gratitude. Then Steven stepped onto the stage. He looked out at the sea of faces and began, not with a story but with a confession. "I thought I was a good leader," he said. "I thought I knew how to shepherd people. And maybe, in some ways, I did. But I was missing something sacred. I was missing the quiet suffering, the people who never raise their hands, who never make the prayer list, who never say, 'I'm drowning,' but are." He paused, until one day God whispered, "Follow her." And I did. A murmur of recognition moved through the room. "And what I found," Steven continued, "wasn't weakness. It was holy strength, hidden courage, and grace that had been fighting in silence." He turned and gestured toward the side of the stage. "Tonight you're not going to hear another message from me. You're going to hear from the one God used to change this church, Julia." The crowd erupted in applause as Julia walked slowly to the stage. She didn't wave. She didn't soak in the moment. She simply nodded and stepped behind the podium, holding nothing but a Bible. She opened to Isaiah 61. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me," she read, "because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." She closed the Bible gently. "That's our calling," she said softly. "Not mine, not Steven's, ours, every single one of us, to see the ones no one sees, to sit in silence with the hurting, to bring warmth to cold apartments and truth to quiet shame." She looked out at the congregation, her voice firm. "You don't need a platform to change lives. You need compassion. You need presence. You need the courage to follow someone into the dark, trusting that God will light the way." She stepped down from the stage. No one moved. No one clapped. They just sat in a sacred stillness. Then slowly, one person stood, then another, and another. Not to celebrate her, but to say yes. Yes to obedience. Yes to interruption. Yes to following grace into the margins. That night, Elevation Church didn't leave the service the same. They couldn't, because something had been birthed in the silence that no structure could contain. After everyone had left, Steven and Julia stood in the sanctuary alone. The lights were dim. The candles flickered. "You think your mom would have liked tonight?" Steven asked. Julia smiled. "She would have made me a grilled cheese sandwich and said I talked too fast." They both laughed. Then Steven grew quiet. "I just want you to know, following you that night wasn't a decision I made. It was obedience I didn't even understand. But I'd do it again, 1,000 times. Because I saw God clearer in that rundown apartment than I ever did in any megachurch conference." Julia placed a hand on his shoulder. "And I saw God in the fact that you didn't look away." They stood in silence, the kind that had once terrified them both, but now felt like home. Outside, the stars were clear again. And as they walked toward the exit, Steven stopped, pulled out his journal, now full, now worn, and wrote his final entry. I followed Julia. God followed both of us, and in the quiet, I finally heard what love sounds like when it refuses to leave. This was never just her story. It was mine too, and maybe it's yours. He closed the journal and walked out into the night, where grace was still whispering, still following, still waiting to be found. And if you've made it this far, if you stayed through every word, every quiet moment, every step of this story, then maybe, just maybe, you were meant to hear this. Maybe you, like Julia, have been silently carrying something no one else can see. Maybe you, like Pastor Steven, have felt the nudge, that soft, persistent voice in your spirit saying, "Look closer, pay attention, follow." Or maybe, like so many in this story, you've been waiting for someone, anyone, to see you. Let this video be a reminder. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are not too far gone, too broken, too late, or too small. Grace is still following you. It doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need perfect words. It meets you in hospital rooms, in quiet apartments, in sleepless nights, in whispered prayers and open wounds. It shows up in the shape of people who are brave enough to care, brave enough to stay, brave enough to listen, and maybe now, it shows up through you. So don't rush past what you're feeling. Sit with it. Ask God who He wants you to follow. Ask Him who in your life needs to be seen. And ask Him to give you the courage to act on the whisper. Because the kingdom of God isn't just built by preachers or pastors. It's built by people who see, people who love, people who follow, like Julia, like Steven, like you. And if you've made it to the very end of this video, I believe it's because God is calling you to something deeper, something quieter, something eternal. So don't just watch, respond. And if this story touched your heart, please share it. Someone out there is waiting for a sign that grace hasn't forgotten them. Let it be this. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the greatest miracles begin when we're willing to follow, even if we don't know where the path will lead.